Olivia's.
All right, so now I can't, Dole, all I can see is your chin. So Mom, maybe you can move it up or you can scoot back a little. There you go. All right, so let's talk. Mom, can you move it? Okay, that's fine. Can you talk a little Shapiro's?
Okay, I'm going to start with my great-grandfather, Joseph Aaron Shapiro, after whom I was named. And almost in every branch of the family, there's a J.A. named for him, including Jean Ann, my aunt, Bobby Shapiro, who was Robert Joseph Aaron, Jerry Shapiro, Jerome Aaron, J. Lewis, who used to be J. Shapiro. We got that.
Yeah.
Judy Ann Shapiro, and Joanne Grower.
Okay.
And including, well, this is an aside, Harvey J., who was another grandson from another marriage. Okay, so Joseph Aaron Shapiro was born in 1857, and he died in 1927. So he was 70. Okay. His first wife gave him the child Ida. Her Jewish name was Heike. And Muriel had the same Jewish name, Heike.
Okay.
So that was my great-grandfather's mother. Ida's mother died in childbirth. And so Joseph married his wife's sister, his second wife. And she gave him a daughter named Rose. And then she died. So he's lost two wives.
Not in childbirth, though, right?
I don't know how the second wife died.
Oh.
She was the sister. So Ida and
Hang on 1 second. Behave yourselves. You're going to be separated. Okay. I won't cut you off again, but I might walk out again. But you could keep talking. I'm recording it.
Oh, okay. Ida and Rose then were half sisters and first cousins. Got it?
Yeah.
Okay. Then his third wife he married in 1887. He's 30 years old. And he married my great-grandmother, Sarah Slutsky. Now, here she is taking on a man with two children to take care of, but she had no dowry. She was very poor. Her father owned a saloon.
Neither did Leslie.
Her father owned a saloon.
Is this in America or this is in Poland?
All of this is in Poland.
Okay.
I'll tell you when we get to America.
Okay.
So she was the daughter of a saloon keeper. And she herself lost her mother when she was a baby. Her mother's name, which is what I'm bringing this up because it's one of your favorite names, her mother was Mayashi. Remember how you liked that?
Yeah,
name?
but that's her actual name, right, on her birth certificate?
Well, they didn't have birth certificates in Poland.
Okay.
They wrote it. If they wrote anything, it was in a Bible.
Okay.
So her name, my great-grandmother, whom we called Bubba, her mother's name was Mayashi.
You got to adjust the screen because all I see is your chin now.
It doesn't matter whether you see me, does it? It's my voice you're supposed to be getting.
Well, that's true. Okay, if you don't mind.
So, meanwhile, this name Mayashi, which you like so much, she had a first cousin who was named Mayashi after her dead mother. In other words, Sarah's mother was the aunt to this Mayashi.
Okay.
And then this Mayashi, who was her first cousin, became her sister-in-law later on,
Oh, okay.
because Sarah's father married a second time, and he had 3 sons. Got
Okay.
it?
Yeah.
And one of the sons married Mayashi,
Okay.
who was Sarah's first cousin.
Okay.
You got this?
Kind of.
So in both families, you've got all these half relationships because of several marriages.
Okay.
Now, Mayashi also was the name of Sarah and Joseph's first daughter.
Okay.
In Poland, she was the second child born after my grandfather, Harry, but she died in infancy. But the name meant so much, of course, that later on, when my great grandmother had her last child, she named her Minnie after Mayashi. So
Okay.
she also became Mayashi. And now we're waiting for you to name your child Mayashi.
Yeah.
Okay. So their first child, they lived in what they called a shtetl. Name was called Brestovitz. And it was about an hour, less than an hour ride from Bialystok in Poland, which is the big city.
Okay.
And I don't know what my grandfather did there, but shortly, my grandfather was born in 1888. That's Harry. Then they had Mayashi, who died. Then they had another boy named Yankel, who died.
Hi.
So, and then finally, the fourth child is Sadie. And she was born in 1893. So there's almost 5 years between the first and second child who survived.
Is that Sadie is J
She's
no?
Joseph Aaron's daughter and
Yeah.
Harry's sister.
But whose mom is she?
She's a Feinstein. Have you met any of the Feinstein?
Yeah. Okay.
She had 3 sons. I think you've met Arthur's children. What's Arthur's son's name? Andrew. Andrew Feinstein. He's a lawyer,
Yeah.
and I think you met him. And his daughter is in a wheelchair. Remember
Okay.
that picture?
Yeah.
Okay. So that takes care of Sadie. Now, best as I can recall, my great grandfather left for America around 94. And I guess by that time he impregnated Sarah, and she had a son again named Yankel, but he lived, and his name was Jack. He was Uncle Jack.
Okay.
Then when he left, he went probably, I don't remember, I don't even know the date. It's either 93, 94. When he went back the first time, he brought back the oldest daughter, Ida. She was now about 14, and he brought her back to Portland. They lived in Portland outside of Middletown, across the river.
In Connecticut, Portland, Connecticut.
Yes.
And do you
That's
know
where,
what?
that's where Laurie lives. You know, my cousin Laurie,
Yeah.
just across the river.
Do you know what he came over for? Why he came?
Well, they all came in order to make a better lit and escape the pogroms in Poland and Russia. Now, he had an uncle in New York who sponsored him
Okay.
in the late 1890s. His name was Nahum Shapiro. And therefore, he was obviously, my great grandfather was very fond of him, because when he came to New York, he gave him all the cloth. They called them rags. He gave them the cloth and the money, fabrics to go and sell in Connecticut. And when he died, my Uncle Nathan was named after him. That's where you get Nahum. Okay, so he's now in Portland, and he's selling the fabrics. He had a wagon. That's how they used to go around to houses and
Up and down the streets,
and
and
down
they had
the
the
street.
food. They would display
Main Street.
the food and everything.
But he obviously, he prospered because he was able to go back now a second time to Poland. And he impregnated my great grandmother. And she had another son named Herman. And he was born in 97. When he came back from that 96, 97, he brought his second daughter, Rose, to Connecticut. So now this man has 2 daughters with him, and he has 4 children in Poland. And my great grandmother is running the saloon, which she helped her father take care of. Okay? So now I didn't know he had made 2 trips back until about 20 years ago when
They left you out of the picture?
When my Uncle Nettie told me that.
Okay.
I never knew that he had gone back. Okay, we update now. We're ready. 2001, Joseph A. Shapiro brings the whole family.
Not 2001.
What? I
Not-
mean, 1901.
Okay.
1901, he brings the rest of the family, his wife and his 4 children, to Middletown. And that same year, my grandfather, Harry, was bar mitzvahed. Prior to that, in 1900, his eldest daughter, Ida, married Morris Poliner, who had a shoe store. And he was from Romania.
Do I know this side of the family?
Pardon?
Do I know that side of the family?
Well, they never had children.
Oh, okay.
So they had a shoe store on Main Street. So she was already married when her stepmother and her half brothers and sister came to America.
Okay.
And then my grandfather, now he's 13 and bar mitzvah, he started working for his father. And just around the time when he was like 14, 15, they opened a store on Main Street, and they called it J.A. Shapiro and Son. And that remained the name for almost 50 years.
What'd they sell?
Clothing. It was a clothing store for men and children. And I think at the beginning they had women's stuff.
Yeah, well, they had some women's stuff, and upstairs they had children's things and women's house dresses and things like that. But downstairs they had one floor that was just men's, but they had working clothes, and that was very successful for them because there was a college in town, and there were people coming to that area.
Farmers.
And so Grandpa was lucky stroke. And then they had in the basement was a shoe department.
Well, not at the beginning.
Not then, yeah.
It was on the main floor. So that it grew, it kept growing. But it started out not where it was on Main Street. It was on Summer Street. It was a little store, and upstairs from the store is where they lived. My great-grandfather and his children lived upstairs. And actually, my mother was born there. Because then when my grandfather, Harry, got married, he also moved into that building. And the store was on the ground floor, and they had the 2 apartments above it.
And then were their customers mostly Jewish or anybody?
I would say they were mostly not Jewish
Oh,
because the Jewish population was very small.
No, they were the
They were
Polish.
Polish and Irish
Yeah.
and Italians. And when Judy mentioned the work clothes, well, there were still a lot of farmers around there, and they would come in for that.
okay.
So they moved to Main Street, the big store, probably around 1920 or so. And then they really prospered. So, all right, let's go back a little bit. The arrival in 1901, and at that time, my great grandmother gets pregnant again,
Slut.
and she has her first American child. And who was that? Morris Shapiro, who was the father of your friend Burton and Jay.
Okay.
And then in 2004,
1904.
pardon?
1904.
Oh, yeah. 1904, she had another son, Philip.
Okay.
And then in October 1905, when my great grandmother was 40 or 41, she had her last child, Minnie, her daughter, whom she named after Mayashi.
Okay.
And my aunt Virginia, Jinky, she is also a Mayashi.
Okay.
That's
What is Stell too?
Hmm?
Stell?
Stella is not Mayashi.
I thought that was. She was.
I'll tell you her name later. Okay. All right. Meanwhile, in 1904, the second daughter gets married, Rose, and she marries a man named Isaac Bellman. And he too had a clothing store. And they lived in Southington, which was near New Britain.
Okay.
Maybe 20 miles from Middletown. Maybe not. Anyway, they lived there and they had two children. She had her first son was named Al, real name Abraham, and he was actually older than Minnie. He was 6 months older.
Oh, he was a young one.
Yeah, but the point is, his aunt, she's his step aunt, but she's his aunt, is 6 months younger than he is.
I got it.
And then they had a daughter, I think in 1907, named Fanny.
All right. Do I know that family?
No,
Okay.
no. We'll get back to them though.
Okay.
Eventually.
Okay, so where are we? We've covered all the children. They lived on Sumner Street. My grandfather is working in J.A. Shapiro and Son. And now it's time to bring in my grandmother, Rose Schwartzbuch. Now, you probably know that my grandfather and grandmother were cousins, too.
Your grandfather.
Harry and Rose Schwartz were cousins.
Okay.
But Rose and my great grandmother, Sarah, they were second cousins. And that means that Harry was a second cousin once removed. He's in the next generation.
You're going to be quizzed on this, you know.
She's got it on tape.
She'll have to read it, walk around with it.
So when my grandfather left Poland, he was only 12. And my grandmother was the same age. So they were children that played together in this shuttle. So
in Poland?
In Poland.
Oh,
Okay.
So they knew each other. And then when my grandmother came to New York in 1906, this is 5 years later, she was 18. And she came to New York and to stay with her sister, Becky. Becky was the older sister who had come before her. And the
Were they
next,
all sponsored by the same uncle?
no, they're not connected.
Oh, it's on the other side.
They're not connected to the Shapiros.
Okay, right.
My great grandmother who was connected. No, they came, I don't know how, but they lived with an aunt of my grandmother's. She
Okay.
wasn't very kind to them. They lived on, I think it was Elizabeth Street in the Lower East Side. And they went into the factories. You've heard about the shirtwaist fire in 1911, something like that, when all these women were killed because they couldn't get out of the factory. Well, that was the kind of factory she worked in.
Okay.
Dozens and dozens of them worked there on the fabrics and how many hours they put in. And they didn't pay them much, and they also didn't protect them anyway. So there was a fire, and hundreds of people died in the block. It wasn't just one building.
Ugh.
So that made a big change in New York. That's when they started with fire exits, fire laws.
Yeah.
So, because when she came here, she communicated with my grandfather in Middletown because he was her cousin. And I guess she wrote to him, and he invited her to Middletown. And that's how their romance started at some point. And then they decided to get married in 1911. So this was 5 years after my grandmother came to this country.
A little hanky-panky might have been going on.
But my grandmother was the third daughter in her family. And in those years, you had to marry in the order of your birth. So she had two sisters, Becky and Libby. And Libby is the grandmother of Ilana.
Okay.
You know Ilana Volk?
Yeah.
She stayed in Europe.
Okay.
She stayed in Europe. So this pushed Becky to get married, my grandmother, and she married her first cousin, Hyman Cronenberg. And then the second daughter, Libby, in Poland, she married Mordecai Volk. So now by November, my grandmother was able to get married in Middletown. We have a picture of it. And her sister Becky was the matron of honor.
So the affair had already begun, but they couldn't get married until everyone else got married off. So they had to wait. Okay.
It's still going on. It's still going on.
What do you mean?
But there's different cultures, but the older one has to get married first.
I saw that in Fiddler on the Roof, so I
Well,
get
it goes all the way back to Jacob. Jacob was in love with Rachel, but he couldn't marry her until he had to marry Leah first because she was older. And he had to wait 7 years to marry Rachel.
Okay.
Okay, so we're now in 1911.
Yep.
Becky, the oldest sister, is in Cleveland.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, please.
Yes, please. What? Don't go
And
tell us
then-
the story. So you have to be quiet.
Okay.
And then my mother was not the first pregnancy. My grandmother lost a child in what they call, she had a, what do you call it?
Stillborn?
No,
Miscarriage?
she had a miscarriage. Grandma Shapiro. Mother was not the firstborn. She had a miscarriage, and then my mother was born in.
Mom, you gotta sit behind so we can see your expressions and face. We want to see your pretty face. You gotta scoot over.
Yellows?
Your mom, scoot over. Scoot behind. There you go. Sit there.
So this is 1913. My mother is the first grandchild on both sides of the family, on the Schwartz side and the Shapiro side, not from her grandfather, because remember, he had two grandchildren from his daughter, Fanny and Al,
Oh,
but she was the first grandchild of his marriage to Sarah.
Sarah Rose.
Sarah is my great grandmother.
Oh,
Got it?
sure.
you asked for it.
It's in the
So-
recording. I'll go back and pay it.
After my mother, Sylvia she was named, her Jewish name was Malka Shifra. And I suppose, as I understand it, this Malka Shifra was an aunt of my grandmother's, and she was blind.
Oh.
And coincidentally, my grandmother's sister May, who came much later, her name was Malka Shifra. She was the first one named after this aunt. But when she came to America in 1921, because she had the same name as my mother, she switched it. She took the real order and called herself May Sylvia,
Hmm.
where my mother was Sylvia May.
Okay.
Because my grandmother twisted the name. She liked Sylvia from Malka Shifra. Malka, a lot of people who are named Molly, that it's because they're named after someone like Malka.
Like our cousin?
Well, I don't.
Which cousin?
She's talking about Molly. No, Molly is not named.
No.
That's a much different thing. She's named after Manny, I think.
Who?
Molly.
Molly? I think so.
Or is
Well,
it
Marnie was named after.
Max? She's named after Max. Yeah, he died in 75 and she was born in 78.
No, I was born in 78. I think, and Molly's older.
She was born in 76. Andrew was born in 78.
Right.
Okay, stand corrected.
Okay.
So then after Virginia, who was Mayashi, and they had Nathan in 1916, and he was named for the great uncle Nahum Shapiro. And then in 1918, Muriel was born, and she was named Heike after her grandfather's mother.
Okay. By the way, did you see the tapestries? Those were made by Susan.
Yeah, my sister pointed them out. You say tapestry, are they quilts?
They're quilts.
Aren't
Yeah.
they quilts?
Yeah.
But I guess when you hang them, doesn't it become a tapestry? Or is that a separate thing?
Well, because carpets were tapestry also.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, it's definitely not carpet. It's like a quilt, yeah. So this one here is for Sylvie, and that one's for Olivia.
Oh, those were baby presents.
Yeah.
Nice.
All right. So, was there anything? Go
So
ahead.
we're at Muriel's birth in 1918.
Okay.
And my grandmother used to work in the store as well. They had a maid who helped take care of the children. And by that time, they had moved from Sumner Street, where the store was, to a big house. And they were not living with the grandparents anymore.
And that's the house they all grew up in?
Well, they kept only till 1925.
Yeah.
So Jean Ann, my youngest aunt, she never knew that house.
Okay.
Something I want to insert here now is that 1918, her sister Becky in Cleveland had a child in 1916 named Jerome. And then in 1919, she had another child named Leonard. Okay, in the summer of 1919, when she was still nursing her second child. The first child was run over by a car, their own car.
Oh gosh.
Somebody had left the brake open, and the car rolled onto the little boy who was playing in the driveway.
That's terrible.
His mother, Becky, was holding the baby, the second child, Leonard. She couldn't get there fast enough
Right.
to save him. So he died. A lot of his nieces and nephews didn't know anything about him until I was on the scene. You heard about their reunion, the Cronenberg reunion
I don't remember.
2 years ago, when they had this huge party in Cleveland, and they got everybody, over 100 people came.
Okay.
Okay, so that's how I was involved in that. Well, Becky was so depressed that my grandmother said she should come to Middletown with the baby, and she would put him and Muriel in the same carriage and take care of them. While their mother, she stayed up in her room, but they stayed almost 3 months in Middletown. And then when she got better, she went back to Cleveland, and she got pregnant with her third son, Sidney Cronenberg, who is the father of Roger. Have you heard about Roger Cronenberg? And Marissa? Have you had any contact with Marissa Cronenberg?
No.
Okay, well, I won't bother you with that now.
Okay. They don't come to the Shapiro part.
No.
Yeah.
So we're in about 1919, and then in 1922, Estelle was born. And Estelle was named Shana Métis. The Métis is after my grandmother's brother, whose name was Mordecai, and he died when he was like 30 years old. He was the next child after my grandmother. And you'll find that in that year, 21 and 22, Alana's father is named Meyer, and Marvin Cronenberg, who's the fourth son, he's named Marvin, and Estelle was named Mabel Stella, Shana Métis.
Okay.
My grandfather put it down as Stella.
Oh.
My grandmother wanted it to be Estelle. Estelle didn't know her legal name was Stella until she applied for her passport.
Wow.
The same Shana Métis,
I'm a Shana Maiden.
is your mother's name. Her name is Haya Shaney. So they're named for the same person.
As who?
That's Estelle.
Oh,
Estelle is Shana Métis, and you are Haya Shaney.
and she's.
Okay.
She missed who she's named for.
All right. Now we're in 1925, and the Shapiro store is very prosperous. My grandfather had a big Hudson car, and they started to build a 2-family house on High Street, which is the house that we knew as children.
Oh, okay.
On one side was for my great-grandparents, Joseph and Sarah, and the other side was for Harry and Rose. And so in 1925, while the house was being built on High Street, very upscale part of the town, they took a trip to Cleveland. And my grandfather hired a chauffeur because it was a 2-day trip. And he hired a chauffeur, and they went to, and that, I don't know if you saw that picture of the reunion of the Cronenbergs and the Shapiros. In the meantime, May a younger sister, had come to America in 1921 and lived in Cleveland. And then you heard of Uncle Saul. Saul and Benny, the youngest brothers, they came in 1922. And Saul was sent to Middletown to work for the Shapiros, and Benny was sent to Cleveland to work for the Cronenbergs.
Okay, so I don't know Benny because he's still with all the Cronenbergs.
Yeah, he died in 1966.
Okay.
All right. But Saul, my grandmother realized Saul was very aggressive. Even though he was only 16 and 17 and 18 working in the store, she saw that he would become a problem because my grandfather's brothers also worked in the store. And so there would be no future for him.
Mm.
So she talked to Becky and that he should go to Cleveland, which was an expanding business. They had an electrical business. They made lamps. And they were,
As dinner's gonna be served in California.
we're almost through.
Okay.
They were very well off. They had built a very big business. So Saul went to Cleveland. I don't know what year. He's not in the picture of 1925.
Okay.
So now Saul works for the Cronenbergs and became a very successful salesperson. Okay, I'm going to get to my great-grandfather's death. So in 1925, they have this new house, and my great-grandfather has a stroke, and he dies in 1927. He was the second person to be buried in the new cemetery. And Morris was buried there 2 years later.
Mm.
And that was one of the rifts they had because Hattie, his wife, wanted him buried in her family plot. And the Shapiros wanted him buried in their plot. And of course, the widow always wins.
Oh. I see. Girls, what are you doing? Okay. Sorry, I had to check on them. They got awfully quiet down there. No, it's time for bath, so you gotta start coming up. Start cleaning up.
Okay, so he has died in 1927. And my grandmother, who was, very, what shall we say, wily.
Oh, your grandmother
Yes.
was kind of what?
Wily, she was very sharp.
Wired?
I don't know if that's the word.
I don't know.
She realized that when he died, he left my grandfather the store to run, and he left $5,000 to each of his sons and unmarried daughter, Minnie. And so that they still had, my grandmother felt that his brothers were too aggressive and they would overtake my grandfather. So she called the Cronenbergs, Jaime, who was her cousin, and her sister, Becky, and asked to borrow $25,000 so they could pay off the brothers and the sister, that they would have no control of the company. And the promise that my grandfather, Harry, would take care of his mother for the rest of her life.
Hmm.
So that was the deal.
Hmm.
And they paid him off, they paid him back. But $25,000 would be like today, $500,000 probably.
Right. Wow.
So then I'm going to finish at this. In 1928, The youngest child, Jean Ann, is born. She was not planned. Let's say she was a change of life. My grandmother was 40, but in those days,
That was
you were
long.
change of life. And that following spring, 1929, my grandmother Shapiro parents came over from Poland to visit. They stayed 6 months, and they stayed in Middletown, and then they went to Cleveland. And my grandparents said, well, why don't you stay here? Come and live here. And they said, oh, why would you do that? We have our home there. We have our children. We have our business. They had a hardware store. So that didn't work out. I'm going to update the story. My mother, who was graduating from high school that year, was given a gift to go to Cleveland. And her grandparents were there. She spent the summer. That became a tradition in the family. And I did it myself in 51 when I was 16. But all the children, like Muriel and Stell and Jean Ann, all went to Cleveland when they were 16. So,
Their grandparents were there?
pardon?
You said their grandparents were there?
My great-grandparents, their grandparents, were in Cleveland visiting from Poland.
Oh,
They were in Middletown first.
okay.
Then they went, and now it was time to come back. Their son had gotten married. Benny had married in June. And my Uncle Nettie was to be bar mitzvahed in September. That's what I'm leading up to.
Okay.
And my mother she brought her grandparents back on the train to New York and then to Middletown. And she wrote in her diary while she's sitting on the train, because I saw the diary, said, I'll probably never see them again.
Aww.
Because they were going to go home after the bar mitzvah. But little did they know at the time on the train that Morris Shapiro had died at the end of August.
Okay.
So when they came back to Middletown, everybody was in mourning. And Nettie did not have a bar mitzvah.
Okay.
And now, as you know, it's her name, Beth. Beth is planning a bar mitzvah for her son on Nettie's birthday,
Aw.
September 12th. And because of the coronavirus, it doesn't look like he's going to have a bar mitzvah either. That is a party. They had a service.
Yeah.
No party.
Okay.
So we'll stop at that point. I brought you from 1857 to 1929.
All right. So we'll pick up in the 1930s.
We're going to have supper now. Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers. Salute. Enjoy.